Germany became an important center for Hebrew literature after Russian writers and academics fled the Revolution of 1917. The Weimar Republic brought emancipation for the 500,000-strong Jewish community, but by 1943 Adolf Hitler had declared Germany Judenrein, literally clean of Jews. This ignored the hundreds of thousands of Eastern European Jews incarcerated on German soil. Around 6 million Jews died in Europe as a direct result of Nazism. The number of Jews affiliated with the Jewish community in Germany is currently around 100,000, the third largest in Europe, but there are many more who are not affiliated with a synagogue. Among them are many of the 250,000 Russian Jews who arrived in Germany between 1989 and 2005 to escape economic and political turmoil, as well as perceived widespread anti-Semitism. World War II. World War II began on September 1, 1939 with the Nazi attack on Poland. France and Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later, but even this could not prevent the quick defeat of Poland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Other countries, including Denmark and Norway, were also soon brought into the Nazi fold. In June 1941 Germany broke its non-aggression pact with Stalin by attacking the USSR. Though successful at first, Operation Barbarossa quickly ran into problems, culminating in the defeat at Stalingrad, today Volgograd, the following winter, forcing the Germans to retreat. With the Normandy invasion of June 1944, Allied troops arrived in formidable force on the European mainland, supported by unrelenting air raids that reduced Germany's cities to rubble and the country's population by 10%. The final Battle of Berlin began in mid-April 1945. More than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers barreled towards the capital from the east, reaching Berlin on April 21 and encircling it on April 25. 2 days later they were in the city center, fighting running street battles with the remaining troops, many of them boys and elderly men. On April 30 the fighting reached the government quarter where Hitler was holed up in his bunker with his longtime mistress Eva Braun, whom he'd married just a day earlier. Finally accepting the inevitability of defeat, the couple killed themselves. As their bodies were burning in the Chancellery courtyard, Red Army soldiers raised the Soviet flag above the Reichstag. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Peace was signed at the U.S. military headquarters in Reims, France, and at the Soviet military headquarters in Berlin. On May 8, 1945, World War II in Europe officially came to an end. The Big Chill. At conferences in Yalta and Potsdam in February and July 1945, respectively, the Allies, the USA, the UK, the Soviet Union and France, redrew Germany's borders and carved up the country into 4 occupied zones. Friction between the Western Allies and the Soviets quickly emerged. While the Western Allies focused on helping Germany get back on its feet by kickstarting the devastated economy, the Soviets insisted on massive reparations and began brutalizing and exploiting their own zone of occupation. Tens of thousands of able-bodied men and POWs ended up in gulags, labor camps, deep in the Soviet Union. Inflation still strained local economies, food shortages affected the population, and the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, and Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, were forced to unite as the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, said, Socialist Unity Party. In the Allied zones, meanwhile, democracy was beginning to take root, as Germany elected state parliaments, 1946–47. The showdown came in June 1948, when the Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark in their zones. The USSR regarded this as a breach of the Potsdam Agreement, under which the powers had agreed to treat Germany as one economic zone. The Soviets issued their own currency, the Ostmark, and announced a full-scale economic blockade of West Berlin. The Allies responded with the remarkable Berlin Airlift. For 11 months, American and British air crews flew in food, coal, machinery and other essential supplies to Tempelhof Airport in West Berlin. By the time the Soviets backed down, the Allies had made 278,000 flights, logged a distance equivalent to 250 round trips to the moon and delivered 2.5 million tons of cargo. East and West. In 1949 the division of Germany, and Berlin, was formalized. The western zones evolved into the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, BRD, Federal Republic of Germany or FRG, with Konrad Adenauer as its first chancellor and Bonn, on the Rhine, as its capital. An economic aid package, dubbed the Marshall Plan, created the basis for West Germany's Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, which saw the economy grow at an average 8% per year between 1951 and 1961. The recovery was largely engineered by Economics Minister Ludwig Erhard, who dealt with an acute labor shortage by inviting about 2.3 million foreign workers, mainly from Turkey, Yugoslavia, and Italy, to Germany, thereby laying the foundation for today's multicultural society. The Soviet zone, meanwhile, grew into the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, DDR, German Democratic Republic or GDR, with East Berlin as its capital and Wilhelm Pieck as its first president. A single party, the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, said, Socialist Unity Party of Germany, led by party boss Walter Ulbricht, dominated economic, judicial and security policy. In order to suppress any opposition, the Ministry for State Security, or Stasi, was established in 1950. Economically, East Germany stagnated, in large part because of the Soviets' continued policy of asset stripping and reparation payments. Stalin's death in 1953 raised hopes for reform but only spurred the GDR government to raise production goals even higher. Smoldering discontent erupted in violence on June 17, 1953, when 10% of GDR workers took to the streets. Soviet troops quashed the uprising, with scores of deaths and the arrest of about 1,200 people. The Wall. Through the 1950s the economic gulf between East and West Germany widened, prompting 3.6 million East Germans, mostly young and well-educated, to seek a future in the West, thus putting the GDR on the brink of economic and political collapse. Eventually, this sustained brain and brawn drain prompted the East German government, with Soviet consent, to build a wall to keep its citizens in. Construction of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War's most potent symbol, began on the night of August 13, 1961. This stealthy act left Berliners stunned. Formal protests from the Western Allies, as well as massive demonstrations in West Berlin, were ignored. Tense times followed. In October 1961, US and Soviet tanks faced off at the Berlin border crossing checkpoint Charlie in a display of brinksmanship. The appointment of Erich Honecker, 1912–94, as leader of East Germany in 1971, combined with the Ostpolitik, East-friendly policy, of West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, 1913–92, allowed for an easier political relationship between the East and the West. In September that year all four allies signed a four-power accord that regulated access between West Berlin and West Germany, guaranteed West Berliners the right to visit East Berlin and the GDR, and even granted GDR citizens permission to travel to West Germany in cases of family emergency. The accord also paved the way for the Grundlagenvertrag, Basic Treaty, signed a year later, in which the two countries recognized each other's sovereignty and borders and committed to setting up permanent missions in Bonn and East Berlin. In 1975 West Germany joined the G6 group of industrial nations. But the 1970s were also a time of terrorism, and several prominent business and political figures were assassinated by the anti-capitalist Red Army faction, RAF. In the same decade, anti-nuclear and green issues appeared on the agenda, which ultimately led to the founding of Die Grünen, the Green Party, in 1980. Reunification. Hearts and minds in Eastern Europe had long been restless for change, but German reunification caught even the most insightful political observers by surprise. The so-called Die Wende, falling of the Berlin Wall and reunification, came about as a gradual development that ended in a big bang, the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989.